I'm Mandy, Rhodes, the editor of Holyrood magazine, and it would appear the token woman on this panel, but I can't be responsible for the people that the parties put up to speak on equality, so there we go. Regardless of gender, I'm sure all will make valuable contributions, and to introduce everybody, we have to the far left, Neil Findlay, Labour's spokesperson on equalities, welfare and social inclusion. Slightly to the right of Neil Findlay, we have Alex Johnstone, the Scottish Conservative spokesperson on housing, but more often than not he's wheeled out to talk about welfare, which I think is because he's prepared to be outspoken and perhaps others aren't, but we'll see. To my immediate left we have Paul McGarry, who's a Lib Dem candidate and someone who has his own personal experience of welfare issues, having been homeless himself, which I'm sure we'll explore. To my right I have Alex Neil, Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Communities and Pensioners' Rights, and to his right we have Andy Wightman, who is the Green spokesperson on kind of everything, I think.
Communities, local government.
So I'm going to give a short introduction, and then each of our panellists will be asked to speak for 1 to 2 minutes on a subject I give them. So I'll think about that as I go along. And then we'll have a discussion between us about things that have been raised and a Q&A with the floor, and I have had some questions submitted as well. So it did seem until very recently that with the machinations surrounding the resignation of Ian Duncan Smith, that David Cameron's Conservatives had gone to great lengths to distance themselves from their nasty party image. But I want to take you back to 1992 when some of us were around, when things were very different. And that year, at party conference, Peter Lilly, who was then the Welfare Secretary, stood up and gave his rendition of a Gilbert and Sullivan's I've Got a Little List, aimed squarely at what he saw as an entrenched culture of benefit entitlement. It's almost inconceivable in the Cameron all in it together government that we have now, that Lilly took on the ditty, including such lines as, young ladies who get pregnant just to jump the housing list, there's none of them to be missed. And I haven't mentioned all those sponging socialists, I've got them on my list. The eventual Labour victory in '97 suggested that the country was probably singing a slightly different tune to the Tories at that time. But regardless of your views on Lilly's singing abilities, the difference was that welfare was actually an election issue. Welfare and social justice might not first appear to be one of the key planks of this election campaign, but they are at the core and kind of underlining almost every other election issue that we have. How do we bridge the inequality gap, for instance? So we're about to see a large transfer of, among other things, tax and welfare powers from Westminster, but will they go far enough to see welfare full square the responsibility of our MSPs? And will our new tax powers be used to prove the accepted wisdom that Scotland is more socially just in terms of how we react to our citizens? Recent polling, today's polling in fact, would suggest that we may be happy for others, richer people, to pay more tax, but we still all want to see a lot of the same free stuff. So let's play fantasy politics and assume, panellists, that you're the next social justice secretary. Where do you start, Neil?
Where I would start would be to put the issue of health and wealth inequality right at the very heart of every single thing that the government does. I would put the responsibility for that in the hands of the First Minister, make them personally accountable for that, because the inequality that we see in Scotland at the moment, I think, is our national shame. People have said in the past sectarianism is our national shame. Sectarianism is part of the mix, but I think the inequality that we have in our society is our national shame. I'm sick of seeing people in the street that I live in, my neighbours, dying young because of the inequality and the poverty that they're experiencing. And so I think that has to be the one overriding policy, and everything that government does should be seen through that. And that means that people have to be bold and have to stand up to, for example, the media and others portraying, you know, you only need to look at past the newsstands today, some of the screaming headlines today. And today of all days, when we see the scandal of what's been happening with these Panama Papers, which is, to me, is the systematic ripping off of working class people by the rich and powerful elites. That's what's been happening here, because PAYE people pay their taxes to fund the public services, and yet there appears to be a whole group of people who see themselves as being exempt for that. So all of that, I think, is the scandal that has to be addressed, and it's all about addressing health and wealth inequality.
Thanks, Neil. Alex?
I was interested in that introduction to be reminded of Peter Lilly. I'd managed to forget about him for about 15 years. One of the great positives of the 1997 election was that Peter Lilly became political history. But there's been a lot of history since then. And one of the things that was very clear in that period, the initial days of that Labour government post-1997, was that welfare was something that required to be reformed. And the outcome was that 10 years into that Labour government, Frank Field became the Welfare and Pensions Minister. And Frank Field made what I would describe as a good initial stab at dealing with the problems of welfare. And that problem was a simple one. It was that huge amounts of public money were being poured into the welfare budget, but we weren't actually getting the results that we wanted from it. For a Labour government, it was perhaps a step too far, and Frank Field wasn't the minister for very long. And what we found was that Labour, as any political party in government would do, having stepped on the tail of the dragon, decided to back off from it. The person who brought that back to the fore after the government changed again was Ian Duncan Smith. And it's no surprise that Ian Duncan Smith actually used Frank Field as a confidant and an advisor as he brought forward his welfare reform proposals. I think IDS was vilified in Scotland for all the wrong reasons. I think there was some cheap political points to be scored by attacking his reforms. But what many didn't realise was that Ian Duncan Smith was actually the man in the cabinet who was defending the interests and the funding that was going into welfare. And it was as a result of that, at least partially, that we saw the falling out that happened after the budget and Ian Duncan Smith's resignation from the government. I think the challenge for us going forward is to make sure that the continuing process of welfare reform delivers effective use of resources, and that the devolution of power to the future Scottish Government is done effectively and is convincingly used to ensure that welfare reform does happen, because the resources are there and we can add more in Scotland if we like, but we've got to make sure they go to the right people for the right reasons. So welfare reform is still at the very top of my agenda.
Thanks, Alex. Paul?
Yeah, just moving on. I mean, we often, when we look at social welfare or issues around individuals, we use these stereotypes, but I think what we don't recognise, what we don't focus on, is the individuals involved. It's quite easy to look at welfare and say, that's for poor people, or homelessness, that's for people down on their luck. But actually, the reality is quite a bit far different. So our approach, if I was Social Justice Minister first, I'd hope that it wasn't a landslide. I'd hope that actually we have the opportunity to work in a cross-party way to address these issues, because I think that's how you get to the root of these problems. It's not about I agree or I disagree, putting party politics ahead of individuals and ahead of the interests of Scotland. It's about working together. And how would we address it? By looking at the individual, by creating opportunities. You may or may not have heard of our party's policy, a penny on education. This is very heart of creating opportunities for individuals, looking at closing the gap between the poorest and the wealthiest, creating opportunities so that we're defined not just simply by where you come from, but by your potential as an individual. And I believe that can make a huge difference to a person's opportunity and the opportunity and potential that they have to do whatever they want. I mean, I, interestingly, over Christmas, spent some time volunteering at a night shelter. And what really stuck out to me there is cross-section of society that were there. Professionals, people who are qualified teachers, qualified scientists, who were there for different circumstances, for breakdown in relationships, through other things that had gone wrong at some stage, and then cascading, one thing after the other, after the other, after the other. Which is why I think we need to stop looking at it from a broad, let's group them all together and come up with one big group sticking plaster, but to look at the individuals and how we can create individual solutions for people that promotes three things: opportunity, education and employment, to help people get out of these situations, to help people fulfill their potential. I mean, that's where the focus would be, on the individual.
Thank you. Alec?
Okay, well, as the Social Justice Secretary, there are 5 key areas that we are pursuing because all of these, I believe, are absolutely fundamental to social justice in Scotland. And let me say, I don't like the word welfare. I think welfare has become a dirty word and used by the right wing in a way that's totally abhorrent, quite frankly, to castigate people who rely on social security. And social security is the right terminology rather than welfare. The 5 key things, if we are to get social justice as the way we would all want it in Scotland, I think number 1 is employment. Maximise employment. History tells us, evidence tells us, the best way to lift people out of poverty, the best way to reduce inequality is for us to have full and fulfilling employment. Secondly, the living wage. 81% of people in Scotland are on the living wage, but 19% are not, and they are the poorest 19%. And I would draw your attention to a report by Health Scotland last year, which demonstrated in reducing health inequalities, the answer wasn't something to do with GP surgeries or reforming acute services or whatever. The evidence and the research they did showed that the one policy intervention that by far had the most impact on reducing health inequalities was for everybody to have the living wage. And by the living wage, I don't mean the con-living wage, I mean the real living wage. Third point is the social wage, and in particular investment in housing, health and education, because these are 3 fundamentals to achieving social justice. The fourth one is the tax and benefit system, and I wish we had more powers in particular over tax and benefits, because I believe they often cause further inequality. The national insurance contribution system in this country actually redistributes income from the richer to the poorer sections of our community. Aspects of income tax, the allowances, redistribute income the wrong way, and it's a great pity we don't have the power to change these. And the final thing is what I call redistribution of power itself. One small example, but important example of that, is the abolition of the fees to go to an industrial tribunal. Imposing fees of £1,200 for people to have to try to get to an industrial tribunal was a redistribution of power away from working people and into the hands of employers in a very unfair way. So the 5 key things are full employment, living wage, social wage, reform of tax and benefits, and redistribution of power in its many aspects.
Thanks, Alex. Mandy?
What was the question again?
What would you do if you were Justice Secretary, Social Justice Secretary? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I agree with Alex. I was going to say this, that we need to stop using...
Which one?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Does that look?
Yes. No, it's an X as well, but just say...
These are the important issues.
Yeah, this word welfare, I just banish it from government. But actually, welfare, just sort of looked up the definition of welfare, it's actually about the health, happiness and fortunes of people. So actually, welfare is for everybody. And yet we've increasingly used it to, I think, to target unfairly on certain groups of society. So I'd reclaim the word social security, which was the terms used in post-war creation of the what was then called the welfare state, because it was actually designed for the welfare of everybody. That was actually the whole point. Well, the first thing I would do is to emphasise a commitment to tackling inequality. And I would, amongst other things, actually respond to the report that the Scottish Government commissioned from Naomi Eisenstadt, which they said they were going to respond to themselves by the end of March, but didn't, which contained a lot of very good recommendations in it. She's put a lot of thought into that. And virtually all of these things are readily implementable actually within the first year of a Scottish Parliament. I would be bold on tax, and we've put forward bold tax proposals. We've actually calculated the Gini coefficient, the equality impact of cutting taxes for the lowest earners and putting tax up for the very, very highest earners. We know from work from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and People that the optimal top tax rate is around 58, 60%, etc. And even if it doesn't raise any revenue, there's been a lot of speculation about this, it's proven that it curbs rent seeking and it curbs the incentive to seek more earnings, and it has a positive impact on inequality. We'd also reform local tax. Local tax system at the moment has been regressive for 25 years, remains the most regressive tax system in the UK. And the fact that the bottom 10% decile and the bottom 20% decile pay the highest rate of all taxes in the UK, 42% I think was the figures from the ONS, compared to 35% tax burden on the richest, is almost exclusively down to the fact that council tax places a burden on the bottom 10% of 5.8% of their income compared to 1.8% at the top, with a tax rate at Band A of 1.42% and a tax rate at the top of 0.29%. And it's that that's principally driving the increased tax burden of the bottom 10%. So we've reformed that. We've got ideas we're going to be publishing on housing to basically socialise the value of land, which will radically increase the amount of quality housing we can build, taking lessons from countries like Germany, where, for example, the real terms price of a house in Germany is the same today as it was in the early 1970s. And yet Germans are living in higher quality homes that for the last 10 years have cost next to nothing to heat because of the high standards and are designed to last twice as long as British homes. And that's because of a very, very different housing model compared to the British model we continue to rely on and the government's continue to support, of a volume house building industry that's interested in little more than land speculation. And finally, we would do something radical on democracy. We need to give power back to people in Scotland. And Britain as a whole, Scotland as well, has lost a lot of local power over the last 40, 50 years, and we would return that because we think a lot of the best solutions to things like health, environmental issues, housing, planning, etc., rest with local people, and we need to strengthen and give much greater fiscal autonomy to local government.
Great, thank you. Right, just before, I should have said at the beginning, for any of you that English the word welfare, it strikes me that it's sadly more than 30 years since I trained as a journalist in Wester Hales, specifically looking at issues of poverty. Everybody on this panel, apart from Andy, represents a party that has been in government and is culpable for the inequality that we have. Andy, why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think in Britain, in the UK, there are a number of reasons for that. Inequality is driven by things like the fact that the City of London finances half the income of the Tory party. London itself, the City of London, is immune from a lot of regulations to control and is basically an offshore tax haven in its own. The dominance of financialisation of capital since the 80s, the abolition of credit controls, the demutualisation of building societies, house prices in London over £500,000 on average. I mean, that's all going to explode. And that's all down to deliberate government policy, which has sought to persuade a small number of people, and we saw it in the last election, very, very small number of people, that their personal interests are best served by things like an inflate housing market. And that secures the election of a government under the British first-past-the-post system. So I think there's a number of reasons that one of the critical things at UK level. In a Scottish context, we don't have that because we have a more representative electoral system. And I think some of the reasons we haven't tackled these issues in Scotland is partly because we've been busy doing lots of other stuff. I mean, my background, a lot of the work I do is on land and stuff, so we only got around to abolishing feudal tenure in 2003. I think Donald Dewar in his first campaign in Aberdeen South had that on his manifesto, and there was just no time at Westminster. So a lot of the Scottish Parliament's time has been busy with sort of catching up, as it were, on the kind of deficit there's been in modernising the sort of legal framework in Scotland for all sorts of reasons. But beyond that, I think there's the same kind of calculus comes into play in Scotland, which is a desire not to offend certain client groups.
Alec, who are you frightened of offending?
I've never been frightened of offending anybody, Mandy, as you know. I've offended a lot of people down the years. Can I just say, first of all, let's look at the glass half filled aspect. Over the last 16 years, I would say this, to paraphrase Jimmy Maxton, the Scottish Parliament has done more in 16 years than the Westminster Parliament has done in 60 years. Now, that's not to say we couldn't have done more. It's not to say there's a lot more to do. It's not to say that we've now got additional powers that will allow us and should mandate us to do a lot more, I think we would all be totally agreed with that. But the fact of life is still a lot of the levers over the kind of policies that we need to change are still going to reside at Westminster. Now, that's not an excuse for inaction, because when we publish our manifesto next week, you will see a very comprehensive social justice action plan designed to reduce the levels of poverty and inequality in Scotland. And of course, we have changed the entire debate on this in the sense that economic growth and redistribution and abolishing poverty and inequality are all part and parcel of the same agenda. Increasing the economic growth of the country is the reverse side of reducing inequality and poverty, and all again the research shows that that's the case. So I think we will publish a radical manifesto next week that will actually show how we're going to use the new powers we're going to get, as well as existing powers, to tackle these issues. But don't forget, if you take
tax since 1999, and no one's done anything about it.
Well, the reason is, originally, as you know, Andy, we were going to introduce the local income tax.
I know the truth of that.
And of course, the power over tax collection still resided at Westminster, and basically HMRC vetoed it, in effect. Yeah. So that's why the powers issue is so important, because if you don't have the power to do it, you can't do it. And we come up against that. Henry introduced one of the best things the Scottish Parliament has ever done, which was free personal care. And the first thing his Labour colleagues did was take the attendance allowance money off the people affected by that. And we're still losing out on that money today. So that's the kind of background we've been operating against.
Neil, I just want, in 2007, I remember a really evocative piece in The Sun, which was a map of Scotland, where Labour had represented at Westminster various parts of Glasgow, and they were the most deprived areas and had been like that for generations. Where do you think Labour went wrong?
Well, I will come to that, Mandy, but can I say, let's not get romantic about the Scottish Parliament. I mean, to say that it's achieved more in 60 years than Westminster has in 60 is just fantasy. I mean, the NHS, the welfare state, pensions, universal education, all of these things that have been created by the UK Parliament, whether we like it or not, it's a Tory government and now, but to say that is just utter rubbish. Tell me one thing that can compare with the NHS, Alec, that's been created by the Scottish Parliament. Tell me.
Well,
you can't, because the reason you can't, because
I got a chance to answer the question.
Although Neil, I would say the NHS was created, but health inequalities have just exploded.
Exactly.
Well, that's a different matter, but I'm talking about the big issues. I think the very good things we've done. Free personal care is an excellent thing. Introducing the introduction of free bus passes, and these things are great things. You can't compare it to the creation of the welfare state and the NHS, the building of 1 million council houses after the war, the nationalisation of the key industries after the war, and the rebuilding of Britain after bankruptcy.
We've had the destruction of all of that in the last 20 years. All of that has been destroyed.
These were massive achievements. And to say that was just, that's been overtaken.
But Westminster's destroyed it.
Without getting drawn into it.
However, I think you absolutely raise a key point about inequality. I set up a commission, Labour Party Commission, on health inequality, and my aim with that was not to write another bloody report that tells us how unequal we are, because they could fill this room 10 times over. We've had them time and again. The aim of it was to create policies that were going to change that. Now, you can only do that if you're willing to take big decisions over tax and spend. And unless we are willing to do that, then these health inequalities will continue and they will get worse. Now, under the period, for example, the last Labour government, child poverty fell by a third. Jobs were created. We had the Future Jobs Fund giving young people opportunities, more young people going into higher education and all the rest. The colleges expanded. All of these things were good. But I was one of that Labour government's biggest critics at the time. And you know the thing is, internal criticism is a good thing. I wish we had some within the governing party at the moment, because we might get better government if you've got internal critics.
I knew you two should be at further ends. And in terms of that, I mean, you're proud of what a Labour Party did when it was in power at Westminster. What about when it was in the Scottish Parliament? Do you think it went far enough?
I think there's many good things it did. I personally, would have liked to have seen it to be much bolder and much more radical, and I would say the same to the current government. I think there's a bit of timidity about Scottish politics where we kind of don't want to stick our neck on the block and say, look, actually there's big decisions to be made, and you know what, some folk might not like it, but that is the business that we're in, and you won't address the deep-seated inequality that, as I say, I see on my doorstep, unless we make big decisions. And those big decisions mean you can't be all things to all people, and I think that's the failing of the current government. They try to be all things to all people.
Do you think if you try not to be all things to all people, you end up out of power?
Well, that can absolutely, and I get that. I get that the political tactic that they are pursuing is to be all things to all people. You're a left-wing socialist in the East End of Glasgow, and you're a fairly right-wing Tory in some other areas in Scotland. Inverness, yes, Inverness would be a good example. I understand that as a political tactic. But don't then at the same time say that you're going to radically change Scotland, because you won't.
Okay, Alec, you don't try to be all things to all people.
No, I try to be a Tory wherever I go. I think people expect that of me, to be honest.
In terms of welfare, if we can just use that phrase, despite everybody's objection to it, do you feel like you are the pariah?
First of all, the word welfare, I'm willing to address that change. I think the use of words is important, and we need to be agreed about the right formal language. But you'll never hear me use these words, I assure you, and that most Conservatives will avoid that. I actually agree with something that Alec Neil said early on, and that is that the secret of success in this field is economic growth. It's about getting people back into work. And however, that highlights one of the problems that we've got. We went through a period where, as we heard, under the last Labour government, there was a lot of positive change when it came to inequalities and poverty in Scotland. But after the economic turmoil of 2008, that went into reverse. And we've now finally got to the point where we're positive again, and that we're beginning to make progress against these things. And that's happening under a Conservative government. Strange, some people might say, but the reason why it's happening is for all the same reasons that happened before, and that is because we're getting economic growth and we're getting people into work. The problem we have in Scotland is that we're not very good at getting the people who don't have jobs into the jobs that we create. And that's where a bit of good old-fashioned right-wing economic thinking might actually deliver a bit more in the Scottish context. Because what we have to do is remember that we've created huge numbers of jobs, and while I have no objection to people coming to this country to do these jobs, that's exactly what's been happening. That most of the new jobs that were created in the area I represent in the North East were filled from Eastern Europe. They weren't filled from the southwest of Scotland. And one of the things that we are extremely weak on is labour mobility in Scotland. We don't take the chance to allow people to move to where the jobs are. And one of the barriers to that is things like housing. We don't build enough social housing, but worse still, we don't build the social housing in the right places. If there's a need for people to have homes, in future we need to build the homes where the jobs are, not where the homeless people are.
And maybe not sell them all off,
well, I guarantee that there are very few council houses that were sold off that actually fell down. And recent figures seem to indicate that the people who wanted to buy their council houses were all long-term tenants. So they were going to stay long-term tenants whether they bought their houses or not. I would suggest that the argument over the selling of social housing was one of the bogus arguments that was used by successive governments to cover up the fact that we just weren't building enough houses for the people who wanted to occupy them.
Paul, in terms of employment, I think everyone's agreed that employment is a route out of poverty, but we now have a thing that seems to be an accepted word, which is in-work poverty. People just aren't getting paid enough. It's all right having a job.
Oh, absolutely. This is why about 3 weeks ago, Willie Rennie pushed that where a company receives a grant from the government, like a very well-known online retailer who received millions of pounds over the last 3 years, that they would have to pay the living wage. And I think this is important. We are slightly tied within the Scottish Parliament in our control over the living wage, but where we can control it, I certainly think we should do. And when it comes to those particular companies, like that well-known online retailer, we certainly can do. I mean, it goes without saying, when I volunteered visited the night shelter in Glasgow, that there were two employees from this very well-known online retailer who were leaving at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to work. They weren't working directly for them, they were working for an agency. But I think that where the government is paying money for these jobs to create this employment, that it certainly should be attached a living wage paid to these people who are working, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go and work. Good people trying honestly to work their way out of the situation they're in. And we should do everything we can to create those opportunities, which is why I think seeing the living wage, not the Tory wage, is certainly very, very important.
Neil, I wanted to come in now.
The question is, in the first place, why are we giving Amazon of all people 10 million quid to locate in Scotland? These people are serial corporate tax avoiders on a grand scale, and we're subsidising them to come in with the worst employment practices that you could probably possibly find in the private sector. That to me is utter madness.
Malik, you wanted to come in on that as well, yeah.
Well, basically, I think the living wage shouldn't just be tied to inward investors. The living wage, I think, should be universal, and the aim should be to get everybody the living wage, because very clearly the vast bulk of people don't work for inward investors, they work for indigenous companies, and clearly everybody should have the living wage if we are going to successfully tackle poverty and inequality.
But we're tied to the powers we currently have, so would you
well, I'm just
follow us in...
I'm just coming to that. I actually am very supportive of the idea that not just in the living wage, but in a whole range of things around procurement and various other things, very clearly we would want, before anybody gets a government contract or before anyone gets any... Well, no, we didn't. Neil, if you would stop interrupting. The fact of life is that under EU legislation, you cannot write into the procurement laws of this country a requirement on the living wage, because it's against the EU legislation, and we would have been fined if we had done so, and the measure would have been undone. And that was Labour's position when Labour was in power as well. The fact of life is we are doing it in other ways. For example, from the 1st of October this year, something that Labour didn't do, we are introducing the living wage for every social care worker in Scotland from the 1st of October this year. And we intend over the next few years to extend the living wage at every single opportunity, but we don't have the power to mandate it. The best way to extend the living wage to everybody is to make the living wage effectively the minimum wage. And that way everybody would be paid the living wage, but we don't have the power to do that because that is a reserved matter.
That surely can't be true. When a charity is applying for a grant or a business is applying for a grant, the question's there, are you a living wage employer?
We ask everybody that.
Do you think everyone should be
accredited? And by the way, can I
accredited?
say, every Liberal in Fife was demanding that we brought, and every Labour representative in Fife at the time was demanding that we pay out to Amazon and bring the jobs to Fife. So there's a bit of...
We'd certainly encourage everyone to be a living wage employer. I mean, it's worth pointing out there's only one political party that is an accredited living wage employer, and it's not yourselves. You can get through it.
We are, and we're not accredited. There are lots of employers who are and haven't gone through the... Let Andy come in first, please.
Well, I am an accredited living wage employer. I don't know if Alec is.
Well, we pay the living wage.
No, but Alec, are you an accredited employer?
But that's a moot point.
No, it's not a moot point, because the government
There are lots of
the government evangelises to try and get companies and individual employers to sign up to be living, and they trumpet it all over the place.
Andy's sitting quite patiently, Andy.
But their own people
I
are
don't
not
employ anyone apart from myself, and I often don't get a living wage. But no, I just wanted to come back on the conversation here because, again, I think we could be more imaginative than this. I mean, Amazon's been mentioned. This is on camera, so I can't remember these figures are entirely accurate. But over the last 10 years, I think Amazon has paid in the region of £1 or £2 million of corporation tax in the UK. And yet, over that same time, it's paid over £2 million to Fife Council in taxes through non-domestic rates. And that's one of the good things about property taxes. You simply can't avoid it. Now, the government's announced it's going to review non-domestic rates, and we've got ideas about how to review non-domestic rates. Unlike them, we haven't put it in the hands of a former banker of RBS to do that, because we don't think that's an appropriate way to review non-domestic rates. But you could tie non-domestic rates to the paying of living wages for employers. You could do that. There's a lot of tools the Scottish Parliament has to ensure that the kind of aspirations we, I think, all share about increasing people's wages can be delivered through the tools we have. For example, through the non-domestic rate system.
I was just going to say, and not in defence of Amazon, but they also employ a lot of people who pay tax.
Yeah.
And if we can bring this back down, clearly welfare and tax are related. I'd like to ask a question. Do you think we should have one body, now that we're getting all these new powers, that deals with tax and welfare?
Well,
Alex?
at the moment, obviously, we've got Revenue Scotland, and that's going to raise the taxes, and we're going to set up a social security agency. And the reason for that is there are two separate jobs to be done, and I think they're quite distinct. And where you have the revenue, for example, involved in trying to also be a social security agency, it has tended not to work very well, either falling down on the revenue side or falling down the social security side. Mm-hmm. And the one thing, and Paul touched on this, the one thing about the social security system we're setting up in Scotland, it should be very much geared to the needs of the individual, and not just a rubber stamping or tick boxing exercise. It should be about the individual, because you need to look at the individual in totality and what they actually need from the state in terms of assistance. And particularly after recent years where the welfare system has been dehumanised, we want to rehumanise the social security system in Scotland, and I don't believe a revenue collecting agency can do that very effectively, which is why we're setting up a separate social security agency.
Alex?
Yeah, from a straight accounting point of view, it looks like it makes sense to combine tax and social security. And we've been going down that road for a number of years, and the main thing that threw up were tax credits. Now, the problem with tax credits was that they were a terrific way of supporting individuals, particularly those who were earning a bit of money but not very much and needed a bit more. All very well and good. The problem was that they very quickly became a subsidy for low-wage employers. So basically, you could afford to pay a low wage knowing that the government would step in and make up the difference. And that's why we got into this extraordinary position where average wages in this country were static, and at the bottom end there was little hope of them increasing as long as the government were going to make up the difference. So the UK government decided to take some radical action on the changes to tax credits, and that's been going on for some time, not just the recent discussion. Tax credits have been getting squeezed. They dealt with that in two ways. They firstly increased the tax threshold to take the lower paid out of tax, but more importantly they've adopted the policy now of trying to force up wages at the bottom end. Now, I know that we argue about what the living wage is and what it actually means, but what the UK government are trying to deliver as a living wage is the first attempt to push up wages at the bottom end. And while it's only $7.20 today, it's likely to be £9 by 2020. That's the target. It will be achieved, I'm sure. So that £9 by 2020 will begin to deliver the kind of support at the bottom end of the wage scales that we should have been delivering long ago. So this is part of a coherent policy that is making employers pay decent wages and can be adopted, can be followed, can be improved on, can be developed over subsequent time to achieve all the positive outcomes that unfortunately are necessary to overcome the extraordinary situation we got into by combining tax and social security, by becoming over-dependent on tax credits and simply allowing them to become a subsidy for low-wage employers.
Neil, there's no doubt that we're getting to a culture where people understand that a living wage is the important thing in this, not just a job. But does your party take some responsibility for institutionalising low pay by introducing tax credits?
Well, I certainly wouldn't apologise for putting money into people's pockets, absolutely no chance. And of course, family credit predated tax credits. I was a housing officer at the time when these, dealing with benefits like this every day, and the difference for people was very significant in how that allowed them to get into employment and steady employment and pay the rent and look after their kids and all the rest of it. So I certainly will not apologise for putting money into people's pockets. I think as a society, and when I talk about society, I talk about Western Europe, the European Union and wider, that the whole economic thrust of the EU has been that it's to increase labour, to decrease labour costs, free movement of people to different areas, and actually what we've seen during that time is the driving down in wages and the driving down in people's terms and conditions. I just think that that's a major problem that we have across Western Europe, and I think it's been repeated elsewhere.
Do you think employers need more of a stick than a carrot to be paying more?
I certainly think some employers need a very big stick. Some employers are very good. Some employers are very good and have very good relations and conditions for the workers, and there's good examples of that. Some are absolutely dreadful, and I've been working alongside a group of young people who are members of the United Union who are working to expose that, and have had some very good victories, for example, in ensuring that waiters and waitresses who work for Pizza Express now get to keep their tips, because they went in, and what they did was, it was very clever, they went in on a Saturday evening and they ordered something, a drink or whatever it was in Pizza Express, and one of them stood up in the chair and announced to all the people in the restaurant that their tips would be kept by management. And somebody came along and quieted them down and said, you have to sit down. And as soon as they sat down, their pal over there stood up and did the same, and the same, and the same, and the same. And this happened at a number of restaurants. Within a week, I think it was a week or a fortnight, Pizza Express had changed their policy, and they now do that. Now, they've been doing that around a number of different employers. The next person who's in their sights is Stephen King, who's a major employer of casual labour in Glasgow in the restaurant, pub and nightclub scene. He's in their sights next. Now, this shows you how a bit of activism and a bit of direct action can sometimes work, and I think that's a good thing.
Just because everybody, all of us seem very sure that work is the important route. Would you give the Scottish Government credit for at least putting a fair work agenda into the Cabinet? That's the first time that that's happened.
Absolutely, I think that's a good move, but it's the delivery of that. What I don't want is just that to be a title and glossy documents. We've got to actually see that coming through into fruition and see very detailed policies working through to working people, because that's what the whole thing is supposed to be about. So, for example, on issues that I've been campaigning on, the blacklisting the construction workers, we've had a lot of warm words, but we still give public sector contracts to all of these companies who've blacklisted hundreds of Scottish workers. We're still dishing out these contracts. Now, I think that's a scandal. And the government said they would stop that. They haven't stopped it. That's all part of the Fair Work agenda. And that's where I think the rhetoric over reality comes in. Because the words are good, but the actions don't follow.
Can I ask Neil, when you say they haven't stopped it, do you mean they haven't stopped blacklisting, or they simply haven't stopped issuing contracts to companies that were once found guilty of blacklisting?
Yes, they continue to give contracts to companies who have been found guilty and are going through the courts, and they said they wouldn't do that.
Alex?
I dispute that. I mean, we're not giving contracts to companies who are blacklisting people.
Alex, that's a very clever choice of words, okay?
Well, it's not,
because what he's saying is,
a fact of
what he's saying
life.
is they are
It's
not.
a fact of life. It's a fact of life.
Let me explain that then.
I realise in your new utopia you don't like dissent coming the other way, Neil, but the reality is we have done that. We've also announced that when we get the powers next year, we're going to abolish the £1,200 fee for workers who've got a grievance against their employer having to go to a tribunal. That is one of the worst and most regressive things this Tory government has done. And I think that will enfranchise workers and give them the strength to be able to go to an industrial tribunal and get fair action where that's required. These are just two examples of the kind of things we're doing within the parameter of the powers that we've got.
Can I just stipulate that this terrible Tory government actually devolved the power to the SNP government in Scotland to consider that in future if they're re-elected?
Paul, you want to...
Yeah, I mean, it's not just infuriating, it's just more rhetoric. I mean, we've got Alec here talking about the living wage. He means the Tory wage, it's not the living wage. You can't call it the living wage, it's not the living wage. And you could say £9 by 2020. With inflation, it's still not going to be the living wage. And it's just rhetoric, and I mean, it makes me mad as somebody who's not in the Parliament yet, somebody who's standing as a candidate who reads this. It makes me mad that we have all this rhetoric. We heard Alex Neil's utopian Scotland, and but there's still poverty on the street. And I don't mean to sort of stand there.
The Liberal that supported the Tories for 5 years is in a very good position to criticise that, quite frankly.
Well, you may or may not know, but I wasn't an MP at the time.
No, but your party were. They supported.
Well, again, you can go back. I mean,
know you
Can
think
I
another.
just, because I feel that this is degenerating into a blame game. But can we move it on to some of the bigger issues? I mean, actually, if we can talk about the Fair Work agenda and people with disabilities getting into work, we have, I think it was a First Minister that once said to me, one of our lost resources are the people that aren't in work. How would you help and support people with disabilities back into work, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, it's about creating more opportunities, creating training, working with companies who are open to supporting people, whatever their needs, giving them more contracts. I recently went with my 5-year-old to the Odeon, and, it is clear, working right across that cinema, that they are an equal opportunities employer who are looking to create opportunities for anyone irrespective of their disabilities, and that's welcome, that's refreshing. And when we look at designating companies as living wage employers, we should also look at how we can recognise those who are equal opportunities employers, so that people actually can make decisions with their feet to go to companies that do have a welcome, open agenda to create opportunities and to make the accommodations when they are needed.
Alex, Steve Crabb next week, I think, is going to say that he's going to prioritise getting disabled people back into work, but that will be at the expense of taking money away from the long-term unemployed. Has it got to be about those choices?
Government expenditure is always about difficult choices, but one of the things that has been a key principle of the Conservative government's approach and the coalition government's approach before it is that we've got to mainstream the employment of those who have disabilities. Now, what Stephen Crabb, I believe, is going to talk about, we'll hear the speech when it comes, is about making sure that people have the training opportunities to allow them to take up jobs that reflect the skills they have. And I think we can work to that agenda in Scotland, we can do it in our own way, but the priority must be to ensure that people are not denied the opportunity to use their skills. Many people who have a disability have skills that are completely separate from the disability they experience. And by taking the view that we need to take away the disadvantages that they have and match up skills to and abilities to opportunities will deliver a better equality for the long-term disabled in the future. But it will take hard work and it will take effort to make these things come together.
Neil, unemployment among disabled people is twice as high than others. What would you do?
It's a subject close to me because my brother has progressive MS and has just, in the last, I think it was about 18 months ago, had to finish up working. He was an engineer to trade, could not continue his trade, and ended up working in the council call centre. And he can't walk at all because of his condition, but he's a very smart guy, and he worked in there for, I think he worked at the council around about 8 or 9 years until his condition got so bad that he had to finish off in the council. He now is at home, and he could do some things, but it's very restrictive. But the lesson from watching what happened with him is that where he had an employer who was very helpful and accommodating to him and went out of their way to ensure that they had access to buildings, they had various systems put in, so if he needed to use the toilet more regular or whatever, then that was understood and allowed. And I think that's the whole crux of this, that we need to make things as easy as possible. All people want is accepted. They don't want any special treatment. They just want to be accepted as a member of the workforce. And if there's things that we need to put in to allow that to happen, then we should. One area in particular where there's a real problem is in apprenticeships, where the number of apprentices from disabled community is very, very low. And part of that is about how people self-present. They don't declare that they're disabled because they're afraid they won't be taken on in the first place. So there's a whole range of things that I think we need to do, but we need to get away initially from the view that people are at it, people are playing the system, and that life on disability benefits is somehow a luxury, because I know from close family experience that's certainly far from the case.
What do you think the role is of the parties? I mean, you may not be aware, but Siobhan McMahon, one of your own MSPs who is disabled, is today criticising the party in Holyrood magazine, saying that you've not done enough about representation, and certainly it looks as if she may not be back in the Parliament. Don't these things have to also happen within the party?
Absolutely. I think we could probably say that across politics. There was, if you think back to people like Jack Ashley, Richard, David Blunkett, and people like that, I mean, it was like real exceptions that people came through, and probably in Holyrood, Dennis Robertson and Holyrood, these are people that are trailblazers, but they shouldn't really be, because if we look at the proportion of the population that's underrepresented, we have a guy who's been doing an internship from Inclusion Scotland, Ryan McMullen, who is a super sharp guy. He's quite a character and very, very clever, and he has given an internal report to the Labour Party on issues that he has found in terms of accessing the political system and how we can support people better. And I certainly hope that the recommendations that he's come forward with are enacted.
Alex, what can governments do you think, around this?
Well, there's a range of things. First of all, if you look at the new powers that are coming next year, the work programme and the work choices programme, which is particularly dedicated to this kind of agenda, unfortunately their budgets have been cut by over 80% between the decision being taken to devolve the powers and the actual devolution of the powers. But leaving that aside, there is scope to orientate these programmes to doing more to help disabled people get into employment. And let me say, as you rightly said, Mandy, the level of employment amongst disabled people is half the level of employment amongst the population generally, but the level of employment of disabled people with learning difficulties is half again. So if you're disabled with learning difficulties, you're likely to be one of 25% level of employment compared to the general population. So I think within the overall agenda, there are certain people who are even more disadvantaged than others.
I think the group that Alex talking about there, the problem there is that they particularly require training to match them with the jobs that they have.
That's right, absolutely.
And I think that regardless of the level of effort that's going in already, we need to focus resources on training for that group so that they can be matched to the jobs that are available.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think the work programme, the work choices programme are areas where we can do more. And also in terms of the benefits that are being transferred, most of the benefits are actually related to disability. So one of the ways in which we can make life a bit easier, for example, for people who are in DLA or in PIP, is completely changing the assessment system. I mean, we've got a ridiculous situation where people who have got lifetime conditions, which means they'll never ever be able to work, and yet these people are called in sometimes on a regular basis for assessment and reassessment, is totally inhumane apart from anything else. And we've said that we'll get rid of that completely. If somebody is in a situation where they've got a lifetime condition, which means they'll never be able to work, then they will not be called in for reassessment once, never mind umpteen times. And that's an example of where we can make the system much more humanitarian and humane than what it is at the present time.
Yeah, I mean, I welcome the opportunity for parties to actually look at themselves and also congratulate Inclusion Scotland for the work that they've done promoting disabilities within politics, creating the internships that are being discussed. But I do think that all parties need to look at ourselves. We've certainly engaged in a process within our party to look at what the roadblocks and barriers were and have an opportunity for us all to discuss our own experiences. I'm partially deaf in my left ear, and I discussed at that opportunity how, particularly in hustings, it could be quite difficult because if I can't see the person, I find it very difficult to hear the person. But that wasn't something, because people can't see it, it wasn't something that people were aware of. But being able to communicate that within the parties, and for all parties to look at themselves and to look at how their processes can encourage more people from across Scotland, not just from disabilities, but also from across the economic spectrum, to see more candidates from poorer communities stand forward and represent their communities. I do think that all political parties have a responsibility to lead by example and to show big companies what they mean when they say inclusive boards, by our cabinets, by our leaderships, by our candidates representing us.
Like, were you a supporter of the cuts to PIP before the U-turn from IDS?
The nature of the cuts that were coming in for the budgets on disability were that they were slightly misrepresented and weren't exactly what some people believed them to be. The total budget for disability benefits was being reduced, but the number of claimants within that group was also likely to be reduced. So the fact was that some people who were classed as disabled would not be classed as disabled within the new system, and as a consequence would be entitled to claim benefits but not disability benefits. So I know that's a difficult thing to explain.
I heard the yes or no question.
The yes or no question, if therefore the question is, do I believe that a proportion of those people who were claiming disability benefits should be supported through back to work benefits, then the answer is yes.
Can I just ask the whole panel, do you think the welfare bill is too high?
The nature of the welfare bill needs to be, it has to match the needs. I believe that for the size of the welfare bill we have, we don't get the value for money we should.
What does
I think
that mean,
that money,
value for money?
That money needs to be used more effectively. Back to work benefits need to be used to get people back to work. Disability benefits need to be concentrated on the people with the greatest disability, and those who are able to end their disabilities and become part of the workforce should be supported to do so. The long-term effect will be, I believe, that demand will be less than it has been in the past, and that government, regardless of its shade, can achieve miracles by going down that road.
Andy's been really quiet, but I heard him sighing.
Well, again, I mean, I forgive you using the welfare bill, but I think the way this has been talked about in the UK has been as if this is a cost and we need to get the cost down. And it seldom looks at the other side of the equation. Absolutely. And that is the vast benefits that have been delivered to the rich.
Absolutely.
I mean, welfare is for everyone, as I said in the dictionary definition. It's for welfare and happiness of everybody. So take housing, for example. Increasing inheritance tax thresholds simply entrenches inequality, and wealth inequality in particular. For example, Osborne wanted to cut £13 billion, I think by the end of this Parliament, off what he called the welfare bill. Capital gains tax exemption on your main residence, so forgoing 18% of the gains you make when you sell your principal residence costs £13.5 billion in the UK. There's lots and lots of ways. The National Audit Office published a report on tax reliefs. The Treasury slapped it over the wrist, saying you're not allowed to publish and do investigations into tax reliefs because Treasury doesn't regard them as spending, and yet National Audit Office said they are spending choices because they're choices not to tax, which has to be balanced by taxing other people. And they had a big argument, and now it's resolved that the National Audit Office will simply stick to doing inquiries into the administration of tax reliefs, which is a great shame, but it produced one report showing that. And there's many exemptions, many tax reliefs that are of benefit to the rich, and that's part of what I would say is the bill, the cost we all pay for the inequality in Britain.
Alex, there is the wider ideological issue about the rich and the poor. When you're in government in Scotland, in a devolved parliament, do you have to deal with this pragmatically and deal with the bits that you can work?
Well, I think the key thing is, to quote Nye Bevan, it was the language of priorities. We've got to prioritise the resources available so that the neediest members of society get the help that they need and get the entitlement that they're entitled to, which is through the social security system. And clearly, if that means raising additional resources, then we've got to raise additional resources. But we've got to make sure, as far as we possibly can, with the powers and the resources we've got, that we look after those who, for various reasons, are least able to look after themselves. And it's not a charity, it's an entitlement. It's something none of us in this room know when we're going to need social security. I mean, there's a famous phrase, we're all just one mortgage payment away from poverty, and there's a lot of truth in that. So social security isn't about a small group of people, which is a static population who scrounge on the rest of society. Every single one of us could need the social security system system at any point in their lives, and if we don't, you're guaranteed at least one member or more members of our families will need it. So we have to look at it as social security for all, as Andy says, not just welfare for a few. And the important point is, if that means taxing people who have got the broader shoulders more, then clearly we have to do that. But also, I totally agree
You
with
haven't
Andy.
done it, though.
No, we have done it.
But you're not
Well, I mean,
you're not going to the 50p tax rate.
No, but the not at the moment. But the proposal we've got still taxes people on higher income above £43,000 more than would otherwise would be the case. But the other point in all of this is that, as Andy says, if you look at the current system, whereby there are huge reliefs, whether it's capital gains tax, corporation tax, income tax, power over those allowances under income tax are not coming to the Parliament. The only thing we've got power over are the bands and the rates. So that, for example, it's a fact of life that the pension allowance costs the Treasury about £40 billion a year. Now, it is reckoned 80% of that money goes into the hands of the better off. Now, one of the policy choices you have, if you have control over that, is that you redirect that resource to help people at the lower end. Unfortunately, we don't have that power. I've already mentioned the way in which national insurance contributions are organised. If you're earning about £15,000 a year, you pay 12% or so on national insurance contribution. If you're earning £150,000 a year, you were lucky if you pay 6% of your income into national insurance contributions. So a lot of the existing system actually redistributes income the wrong way.
That's less regressive than the council tax.
Neil.
You asked if the welfare bill was too high. Well, Mandy, you better believe it's too high, but not the social welfare bill, the corporate welfare bill, the corporate welfare that we pay out to corporations on a grand scale. Look at what's happened. Tax cuts for the rich, benefit cuts for the poor, subsidies for the corporations who already pay bugger all in tax, capital gains tax thresholds increase, top rate tax cut, corporate tax cut. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And this term, corporate welfare, has become an accepted term, that we're handing money hand over fist to the people who have got most. And yet the whole thrust of this debate is how can we take more money off people at the bottom end of the scale in comparison to benefit fraud, which is a tiny amount within the system compared to corporate tax evasion and avoidance. Then we're just not talking about the same thing.
I think it is inevitable within this discussion that we get into that wider issue, but it's also one that we can't necessarily solve within the Scottish Parliament. No. Is it?
No, I mean, I'd just like to say, when you discuss the welfare bill, is it too high or too low? And we discuss, the rich people, the poor people. And again, if I can actually just say, I mean, in terms of the proposals from the SNP and what you've done on welfare and the proposals for the new tax, we support it. That's sensible. But what we need to do, though, is we need to focus on dignity. We need to stop looking at how do we cut this down where we can, penalise that group of people or punish that group of people. We need to look at the individuals. How do you reduce welfare bill? Well, I believe it's by creating education, opportunity, employment opportunities for all. That's how you reduce it, by creating more opportunities, not just sticking plaster politics that addresses the homeless people by temporary accommodation. We need to actually focus on those who need the help, actually giving them training, education and employment opportunities. Today we've got statistics from Shelter showing that the number of young homeless has increased. We need to change this. It isn't just about temporary accommodation. This is about looking at the individual, how we can help them. As a party, we propose creating 11 centres for young homeless based on a foyer project which is available in England, somewhere where I was fortunate to get a place when I was homeless. But it's about creating opportunities, about creating apprenticeships, giving the individual the opportunity to reach their potential, rather than looking at the welfare bill going, we need a cut 5%. How do we do that? Well, there's that group, we think they're shirking, let's just cut them. No, we need to actually look at it a completely different way. How do we create opportunities? That's the way. And I'd encourage you, Alec, to take that on board, to look at that as part of the plans. I've told you I support it, so let's go further.
We're already doing all of that.
But you're not.
Oh, yeah.
Can I just raise an issue that hasn't yet been talked about, and that's women. So women have been the most adversely affected by welfare reforms. What are you all going to do to encourage more women into the workplace and support them if they actually want to stay at home and raise their families? Neil?
Can I say one of the most compelling bits of evidence that we had during the inquiry in welfare reform was from, I think it was Angela O'Hagan, from the Scottish Women's Budget Group, and she was talking about the cuts to local government and how they have disproportionately impacted on women. And there was some members of the committee just didn't want to accept her argument. But what she was pointing out was that the council tax freeze, the gain that people get from the council tax freeze was completely diminished by the loss of public services that those women would experience.
A council tax freeze that your party had supported?
Well, you know, my views on the council tax freeze are long on the record that I think that whichever party was in power, whichever council agreed to it, I think that was the wrong policy, and we should have had we should have had a freeze for the people at the low end of the scale, absolutely. But for people like me who can pay more, we should be paying more. And that's because the public services that low-paid women in particular gain most from are being ripped out of our communities. The local government is in crisis at the moment, and these services are my phrase is that these services are the civilising force in our society, and women in particular gain most from them. Now, all of those things about helping women into work through childcare, which is still predominantly lands on women, and the schemes that are put in locally, local authorities to encourage women back into work. College education, another area, a huge area for where people can get back into work.
So-called part-time courses.
Well, you know, you almost said it, Alec. It was the part-time courses at colleges were described by one MSP as hobby courses. One of the most insulting things that I've heard in that parliament, because I've came through college. I've been in college 3 times in my life, and a fantastic assistance it gave to me. But all of these things are being eaten away, and these are what provide women and others the opportunities.
You wanted to come in there, Al?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, I mean, I represent a constituency in North Lanarkshire, and it's not the only council in this category, but one of the most disgraceful things and unacceptable things in local government is the ongoing refusal of councils like North Lanarkshire to pay equal pay to women workers. And they've been fighting that now for 10, 12, 14 years. And if you look at the legal bills and the money that's been wasted in these local authorities with huge legal bills to fight the women who are claiming equal pay, it's absolutely obscene. And you know, I think one of the quickest ways we can give respect and dignity to women is to implement equal pay that should have been implemented years ago. There is no excuse for any council, and I include anyone, you know, it doesn't matter politics, any council that's not paying equal pay, in my view, is not doing a service to anybody, and not even a service to the people who use the council services, because clearly a lot of these women are in fairly low paid jobs. The way in which they're being treated is absolutely unacceptable.
Alex?
Yeah, one of the things that we always need to keep very clearly in our focus on the economy is that there are an awful lot of women out there who are, largely for reasons of family, are out of the workforce for a while, and we need to make sure that whatever route these women choose to get back into the workforce, that they can do so effectively and without blocks being placed in their path. Now, that involves training at every level, because college courses, even part-time courses, are one of the stepping stones that women use to get back into work. It's also the case that women find these kind of part-time jobs that are the stepping stones back into work within the retail sector, and we put artificial pressure on the retail sector in Scotland at the moment, which makes that more difficult. So yes, I agree with everything that's said about equality of pay, that we need to deal with these problems, but we also need to remember that there are an awful lot of women out there who want to take advantage of the opportunities that are afforded them by things like 0 hours contracts to work their way back into the workforce. We should encourage and support them.
Andy, you wanted to come?
Yes, just very briefly. I mean, equality is one of the 4 key core principles of the Green Movement. And I think it was the House Commons Library produced research a year or so ago showing that 70 to 80% of the savings that have been made by the UK government in social security and taxation and pay and pensions has come from women's incomes. So what we're proposing in our manifesto is 2 things: a gender equality bill to entrench and put in a statutory footing some of the good practice that's been achieved, and also a much, much more robust equalities assessment framework, so that everything that government does is more robustly assessed in terms of its impact on equalities, not just gender equality, but other equalities as well. And finally, picking up Alex's point about North Lanarkshire and equal pay, I mean, obviously I entirely agree, but part of the backdrop to all of this is the fact that there's been a long-term systematic decline in the status and democratic accountability of local government. We need to get turnouts out. Turnouts at the last local elections were 39%. Iceland, with a population of less than Dundee, with 72 councils, their turnout fell below 80% in 2010, and there was a national outcry as to why people didn't care how they were governed. 39% was met with a shrug of the shoulders. Now, there should be no reason in a functioning democracy why, if your local council is not paying equal pay, there should be no reason at all why that can't be held to account by the people. And I think we've got to a stage where people simply shrug their shoulders. And that's why I think the next Parliament, and indeed the next Parliament, this is a big, big project. We need to strengthen democracy right across Scotland, so people feel that if something, like equal pay is not being involved or whatever, they don't simply escalate that up to the next level. And your mailbox, I'm sure, will be full of complaints about things that really should be done with a local level. MPs get it with stuff that perhaps you should be doing. I don't know. And it's just kind of undermining people's sense of living in a democracy where they can actually make a difference. So I think actually the way in which we're governed and how our democracy works actually underpins a lot of the failings that are coming through in the system.
I would imagine today the turnout in Iceland would be quite high. Paul, just to finish on that.
Yeah, that was their municipal election.
If indeed they still have
Absolutely, and for us, I mean, we go back to the penny for education investment in more childcare. I was proud of Willie Rennie for securing in this Scottish Parliament additional funds for childcare, but it's still not the full picture. It's still not accessible to all. I mean, I spoke with a nurse recently. She's needs to work shift work, needs to work evenings, needs to work during the day, and her childcare bill is £1,500. If it wasn't for the good grace of her parents looking after her children overnight, she couldn't continue as a nurse. We'd lose that person from the workforce, because in order to get childcare that suits her profession, it's £1,500 a month it would have cost her. And that's just disgraceful. So we need to work more as a Parliament to look at childcare as a broader picture, to encourage employers to be more flexible in creating flexibility around childcare arrangements, but also in our nurseries to be more flexible. A 9 to 3 nursery is no good when you have a 9 to 5 job. And then what are you going to do for that extra 2 hours? A lot of people in the constituency, in your constituency, which I also represent, they're having to go to private nurseries, and we need to address how that is, and we need to go further. That's why our penny for education will give more investment into nurseries so that we can address those issues.
Okay, what I'd like to do is open it out to the floor. So if we can see hands, and I'll maybe take them in a kind of threes, and if you could then say who you are and we'll address them to the panel. So if we take 1, 2, 3, if we take the 4 actually, take the 1, 2, 3, and then we'll come back to the 2. Yeah. If you give your names and who you are.
Right, I'm Paul Spicker. I'm a now retired professor of public policy, and I write about social security issues. I'm going to disagree with the entire panel. And start off by saying I'm disappointed that a debate which is nominally about welfare, social security, however we do it, should have been dominated to the extent it has by discussions of employment. More than half the benefits that are paid go to older people who are not part of the labour market. More than half the remaining benefits go to people irrespective of whether or not they are in work. More than half of what remains go to people who have been classified, generally through assessment or certification, as for them being, it is unreasonable to expect them to work. That's the statutory rubric on employment and support allowance. More than half of the people left after that will be, the people who can work, will be back at work within a year. In fact, it's well over 80%. So it's tiny, tiny, tiny numbers of people who actually need or to be supported into employment or where that's appropriate. But we're having this drive the entire system. What I would like to ask people is, what are they going to do for the people who are not part of the labour market, who are not expected to be part of the labour market, and for whom the labour market is irrelevant?
Okay, great. That was a lot of halves as well, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It whittles away like Russian dolls.
And the two at the back.
Hi, Dan Sanderson from the Herald. Andy mentioned at the start the Scottish Government haven't responded to the Poverty Advisors report by the end of March as the 2nd of Wood, so I'm just hoping Alec Neil could explain why that was, and for the whole panel, do they agree with her that it's time to take winter fuel payments away from rich pensioners and spend that money on people in genuine poverty?
And the lady at the back.
I'd like to make a succession of points.
Who are you?
Fiona Simper, Autism Rights. Talked about public sector. I think nobody's ever even mentioned high pay in the public sector as being a drain on our finances. There was a survey done recently where it was pointed out that whereas in England high pay is predominantly paid to the financial sector, in Scotland it goes to the health and social care sector. I can give you an example. A friend of mine whose son's proportion of the payments that are allocated to him for social care, 75% of it goes on administration, and the only way she found that out was through doing a data subject access request. 75% on administration, 25% on the actual employment of the people concerned. You talk about redistribution of power. I'm a full-time carer, my son is autistic, and I'd just like to point out that, well, one other point I'd just like to make, which is slightly to the side, is you talk about employment. And yet you fail to mention for the past 36 years there has been zero industrial strategy in this country apart from dismantling our industry. And we're seeing that the steel crisis is the latest aspect of that. Taxation. What about household taxation?
Can you just give us one?
I'm going to give you a couple more points because I think people like me are hugely underrepresented. We don't get to ask the questions, and I really would like the opportunity.
But I would like to give everybody
it's only
else
going to be
the
very,
opportunity.
very quick. Household taxation. Why is it that in Europe and other advanced nations, taxation is on the basis of a household and not on individual taxation? It's discriminatory against people like myself who have to stay at home and look after somebody with a disability. I'm expected to basically look after my son until I drop because adult care for people with learning disabilities, and particularly those with autism, is the mental health system. There is nothing else. And that's not according to me, that's the Royal College of Psychiatrists. One more point, there is no local democracy for people like me. None whatsoever. So that's something that Andy has to bear in mind when he's talking about local democracy. If you are in a small minority, you have no power whatsoever. There is huge abuse of power in the public sector against families like my own, and there is absolutely no recognition of that amongst politicians.
Okay, thanks Fiona. Right, so who will we come to first? Andy, you were mentioned last, so I think we'll come to you first.
Yes. No, I take a lot of those points. Paul, take them first. Folk not in the labour market. I mean, long-standing Scottish Green Party, Green Movement policy for a citizen's income. We can't implement a citizen's income, but we think the evidence for instituting one to replace a large part of the tax and benefit system is compelling. So that's the answer we're giving on that. Naomi's report, yes, I don't know. High pay, yeah, absolutely, and that's why we focused on our tax proposals on tackling inequality and resisting the temptation to rent seek, which is what's been happening. And in fact, there was a study done by David Bell, you can come and see the graph here, From
Andy, I
97...
think you should explain what rent-seeking means to lots of people.
Okay, rent-seeking is the abuse of power to seek rewards for which you have not put in any additional labour. I mean, we could have a seminar on rents.
I know,
but
handy
that's
on the doorsteps.
Yeah, well, yeah, it doesn't work.
No.
But it's the opposite of earned, what we'd normally consider to be earned income. It's the
You'll
abuse
just
of power.
call it unearned income then.
Well, it's an earned income, but it's an action, it's an activity which elites adopt to create the impression that they're worth more than everybody else. And we see it in the rhetoric around, also on the independence referendum, etc. People will flee. We see it now with debates about top rate of tax. People will flee as if we have to be in hock to those people. But between 97 and 2009, the share of income amongst taxpayers in Scotland has increased by almost 2% by the top percent. They've seen their share increase by 2%. That's the graph there, if you can see. Every single other person has been at the expense of the top 1%, and that's why we need to tackle that. On local democracy, just to finish off, absolutely, I agree, and that's why we need a much, much more rigorous debate on this. For example, in a country like Norway or indeed Germany, you have communes and municipalities of about 6,000 people. It means who are responsible for about half of their own tax base, from their own taxpayers. And that means that the people you meet in a meeting like this, or going down to the shops or in the pub or picking up your kids from school, are people who are spending half of your taxes. And I think that for people who feel marginalised, people who feel out with the democratic system, for people who don't feel they have a voice, that is genuinely transformative. But I also suggest that we also do need a much greater democratic input into things like the health and social care system. It's ridiculous. I was at an Alliance Hustings yesterday, I think you were there too, I can't remember, where people were coming forward with a lot of complaints, but also a lot of brilliant ideas. But the problem is these all have to be funneled through a cabinet secretary. That's bizarre. There's a few other countries that deal with that kind of system in that way. So localising things, getting things pushed down to the local level, much, much more accountability, both for decisions that are made and for money that's allocated to allow people, as with the health and social care integration, to, you know, if it's appropriate to give someone a free pass for a swimming pool to manage pain, that's a much, much more effective thing than getting them in and out of hospitals, etc. So we're going in the right direction, but I think we need to do a lot more in that direction.
And what about Darren's point on giving winter fuel payments to rich people?
Well, we basically believe in the universal principle. We think it's much more cost effective in general terms to have universal benefits. Having said that, the principal reason that people need winter fuel payments is because A, they're in poverty, or B, increasingly they have houses that are really hard to heat. And that's bizarre, and you know, any of us are going around canvassing or up and down stairs and landings and stuff, seeing the condition of Scotland's housing stock and looking at the standards of housing in countries like Germany, where social housing is now a profitable activity for the occupiers because they generate more income from renewable energy from solar panels on the roof than they pay in rent. So we need to have a transformation in housing and eliminate, and that's where Greens will focus their attention, is eliminating the structural causes of inequality, the structural causes of poverty, and the reasons why we even need to have a system of winter fuel payments.
Alex?
Can I first of all deal with this issue about democracy and empowerment? I actually agree with Andy, and the SNP agrees that we need to do much, much more in terms of community empowerment. And I think you'll see when we publish our manifesto next week, and from the, you know, our intentions is very much, if we are re-elected, to do much more in terms of community empowerment. And by community empowerment, I'm not talking necessarily about more power to councils. It's below the council level where a lot of the frustration actually is about the ability of people to influence things. And you know, we've passed the Community Empowerment Act, which gives a whole host of new powers to communities to buy, for example, or to get surplus property from local authorities, and a whole range of other things. And we'll continue down that path. And in certain policy areas, I mean, we've already said that in relation to education, more power needs to be given to head teachers. In relation to housing, I believe that we need much more in terms of tenant control and tenant management of housing. There's a whole range of different ways in which we need to empower communities much more than we've done. And I think, to be honest, the Parliament needs to turn its attention to community empowerment in a much bigger way than we've done in the past. Second point, Paul raised the issue about social justice. My understanding was, by the way, that this was about welfare and social justice, not just welfare and social security.
I know,
which is
we've
why,
kind of got-
which is why I think we're also talking about employment.
Rubbish chair.
Yeah, not at all. The general point I think you're trying to make, though, Paul, is there are some people who rely and will continue to rely on the social security system who are not ever going to be back into the labour market. Now, I've already mentioned, for example, people with long-term conditions who come into that category, and my view is that you don't bring them back for continual reassessment because it's very stressful to them, it's a waste of resource, and it's totally inhumane. And it's an example of where we, with the limited powers we have, we're going to change the system so that it reflects the needs of these people as well as the needs of people who eventually want to return to the labour market. Third point, in winter fuel payments, exactly the same as Andy. Our intention is that this would continue as a universal benefit paid for by a fair taxation system. As far as the Poverty Advisor's report's concerned, that came nearly towards the end of the Parliament. The detailed response will be made if we're re-elected after we come back, but I think it's very clear from all the other statements we've made as a government before the Parliament rose and in the campaign that very much the recommendations made in this report, obviously we are treating very seriously, and I think the First Minister's indicated quite a number of them already, housing being a good example, where we're already stepping up to the plate in increasing very substantially the target for new house building in the new Parliament, not just in terms of socially rented housing, but generally in terms of affordable housing and indeed all types of housing, because the demand for new housing covers every tenure in Scotland for the next few years or so. And finally, I wouldn't answer every single one of Fiona's points, but she mentioned high pay in the public sector, and I think you specifically mentioned the health sector. When you actually analyse that, the vast bulk of the people who are paid large amounts in the health service are senior doctors and consultants and the like. And to be honest, there you're competing with other countries in the UK and elsewhere in order to retain these people so that they can deliver the quality of health service that we have in Scotland and continue to improve it.
I would like to claim some responsibility for the report. I think Fiona's mentioning the SPICE report, where it showed more people in the health and social work area than in finance earning more. It actually was based on 20 people. I think there needs... The survey was based on 20 people, and there needs to be more work done on to find out who those high taxpayers are and what they do. Sorry, Fiona, I'm just going to carry on.
Can I just add to that, on the administration point, obviously we have reduced the number of senior managers by 25% in the National Health Service.
But it would be interesting to know who is earning what and where, I think.
Yeah, I mean, on local democracy, it's interesting to hear Alex Neil and his reversal of the SNP's centralisation policy that he appears to be declaring. This is welcome news because, you know, the life is getting centralised out of Scotland at the moment by the SNP, pulled away from local authority, away from local communities, local budgets being cut, centralised Police Scotland, you know, you could go on and on and on. Every service they possibly can, money pulled away, pulled into the central pot, centralising the life out of Scotland. So, to hear Alex Neil say that next week their policy proposals are going to be a reversal on that, I'd welcome, but I don't think it's true. With regards to older people, I mean, I do wonder if the reason we're talking about it less is to do with the triple lock guarantee on pensions. You know, that's a policy proposed by, well, you can guess which party, implemented in the coalition government. And I do wonder if that's the reason why it's less of a topic. Because certainly in 2010, 2007, going back the way, it was a top topic. But it has come up less. And I just wonder, maybe you can come back to us afterwards, if that might be a reason for that. And going back, high pay, yeah, it's not good enough. In local authorities, getting paid sort of 3 times what MSPs are paid, twice what doctors are paid, twice what head teachers are paid, more than the Prime Minister. You could go on and on and on. It's not right. and it needs to be changed, and it needs to have action taken to address the high pay of local authorities, where we're not just talking, £100,000 or £140,000. If you were to invent a tax rate for them, it would be the super high. People paid over 200 grand a year. That's not right. Not in local authorities. They're instituting cuts, cutting back, making staff redundant. That's just not right. And in terms of...
Government paid that much in Scotland.
Sorry?
I think the general point, though, is that...
There's nobody in local government in Scotland paid over £200,000.
Not in Glasgow?
Not
One of the lowest.
Yeah.
I stand corrected and I apologise, but it's certainly six figures.
Time in politics, it's fine.
It's certainly six figures. And looking at particularly your case in terms of carers allowance, you hopefully find some comfort, but probably not an awful lot, to know that largely the parties agree that we should look at increasing the carers allowance so that it's in line with employment benefit. I think that's something that's been outstanding for a long time, and I welcome that and look to see that introduced in the next Parliament. Now that we do have virtually, your party's proposing it, we're proposing it, I think Labour's proposing it as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Right, Alec.
Yeah, I'm slightly worried about some of the stuff I've heard. As we
From
just
the
heard,
panel?
yeah, indeed. This government has been a centralising government. It's taken power away from local authorities. It's taken decision making, and it's taken funding away from local authorities. And we hear today that it's going to kick the ball back over the heads of our local authorities into the hands of communities. Now, communities are wonderful things and we all know what they are, but in practice they can be different things in different places and different things to different people. And I think that is an example of replacing a formal structure of local democracy with an indeterminate and informal structure of local authority. And the only way that can possibly be made to work is to introduce a new tier of local government that I don't think we've ever discussed in any detail. The issue of high pay, I haven't much to contribute to that, but the one thing I can tell you is that if you are reliant on a health board in the north or the northeast of Scotland, it may be the same in other places, but we have serious difficulties recruiting some of the most highly qualified staff in our hospitals, for example, and there's some very high salaries being paid, but there's also unfilled posts in many of our hospitals in the north and northeast, and that is an example of that internal market and very highly skilled people that Alec Neil was talking about a moment ago. So while the local authority issue may be one that we can deal with in a different way, there are certainly health boards that have little alternative but to go into the marketplace and try to recruit the best and pay the best when that's necessary. There's one issue that was mentioned in the opening remarks, and I think they probably need to address it in fairly general terms, and that is the structure of the benefit system and how it's focused most heavily on pensioners. And I think the gentleman at the back talked about support given to wealthy pensioners, I think was the phrase that he may have used. I think there's an issue there that we need to consider very seriously, and that is that in this country, everybody buys in to the system. Everybody accepts that they will contribute, they will put money in, they'll do it all their lives, and most people do pay into the system all their lives, and they do that in the expectation that they will get something back. Now, if we were to move to a system where people were expected to pay all their lives, and then if they'd done reasonably well or if they put some savings away, not get something back out of the system as pensioners, I think that would be an acceptable thing for some of us to propose. But I think what it would do is it would begin to undermine the buy-in that we have in this country to the system that exists and the one that we, regardless of whether we think it can be changed, that we feel that we are part of. And I wouldn't be surprised if we went down that road if within a generation or two we actually found the system itself being threatened by people's lack of will to participate in a system that they had no hope of ever getting anything back from. So I think there is an element of universality in the positive contributory side that is dependent on the element of universality that exists in the reverse direction.
But not in further education for the Tories?
I think that you need to give me a while to develop that argument in the same way. I think when it comes to higher education, that the problem of underfunding of our universities will become a critical one, and alternative funding streams will be necessary. We've got an idea, we've put it forward. Are we going to wait till the collapse of our universities is upon us before anybody else comes up with an idea?
Neil?
Number of points there. On the issue you raised, I think for that group of people, the key thing is public services. It's the public services that support them in their life, whether they're old, whether they're disabled or vulnerable or whatever. And it's the public services that are melting away in our hand at the moment because of the underfunding, particularly in local government. I served 9 years in a local authority. We were named UK Council of the Year because we delivered high quality public services, value for money, and people respected that. Those services are disappearing because of the money that's been ripped out of local government by Alex's government. And, you know, things like social care, things like support for getting back to work, the support for disabled people, people with learning disabilities, all of that stuff is being hacked away. It's not being cut, it's been savaged and hacked away as local government is not through to the bone, they're right through to the marrow and they're almost out the other end. And unless we address local government and properly fund local government, then I really fear for what's going to happen to the fabric of society, because we can already see it in our communities at the moment. In terms of high pay, that's maybe the wrong route to say this, but the charitable sector also has an issue with some huge charities paying massive salaries to chief executives and the like, and that's an issue there as well. And I think this is all part of this thing that's coming to, I think, a crescendo at the moment with the Panama stuff, where there is a group of people, they are completely insulated from any of the other stuff that's going on in society, from a whole group of other folk who are just expected to pay their bills and just get on with life. But for another group of folk, life's completely different, and it's a major issue. I was really heartened by the women at the back mentioning industrial strategy, because that is something that is absolutely crying out in Scotland for an industrial strategy that gets people into making things, producing things, not relying just on financial services and the like, but we actually see an industrial strategy develop right through the whole policy agenda, and we can do that if we put our minds to it. We've done it in the past. This issue about taxing, that Dan raised about taxing heating allowances, you know, if you create a system, a means-tested system, you have to create some kind of system where some bureaucracy where you give some people some things and you don't give other people other things. And you know what? We have a system that works that out, and it's called the tax system. And we should be willing to use that. So, for example, a High Court judge getting, free this, that, and the next thing. Why do we not use the tax system to take more back than what we give them? And the tax system, I think, is the leveller in all of this, and we should be willing to use it.
So would you remove fuel payments for welfare?
No, I wouldn't, but I would use the tax system in order to take the money back from people who can
So you'd give it to them but take it away?
Well, that's what the tax system should be for.
Should all benefits be taxable?
No, this is my personal view, that some of these things should be included in the tax system so that we take some of that money back. Otherwise, you're creating...
But from a party point of view, are you against universal benefits?
No, absolutely not.
But just on a personal level, you are?
No, I'm not against universal benefits. You give everybody the benefit.
I think you're misunderstanding here. You're thinking that Neil's saying you should include the winter fuel payment in your tax return. You're not saying that. You're just saying the general system.
The general system is that you pay more, and that's how it should
But you'd
be.
still give them
the whole
universal
principle,
benefit.
I think, is about proportionate universalism, so everybody gets. But for the people who need more, they get more assistance. That's the way that the system should work. And as for the issue of Alex's conversion to decentralisation, well, I'm waiting on a cloud opening up and sunshine coming down, and I mean, it is just totally runs completely.
There was legislation around this, but
You have passed the Community Empowerment Act, which is actually the best that's ever been
Can
done.
I tell you, Alec, they were celebrating in the streets in Falthouse where I live when that Community Empowerment
Well, a
Bill
lot
went
of
through.
communities were celebrating
Absolutely
actually
not.
because they were
Look
getting
at what
access
you've
to
actually look at what you've done.
That's
The council tax freeze was centralising. The colleges policy centralising. You've took in so many planning decisions and made the decision yourself because local authorities, you didn't like what local authorities did. That is the way. You were the minister responsible for some
rubbish.
of them.
What about the Hamilton
So
incinerator?
the conversion.
can we have
Conversion
some
to
more
decentralisation.
questions, please? Right, so the three in this side first. Thanks. Yep. Decide who goes first.
There's no one behind you, Darren.
Darren.
I'm Derek Young, I'm policy officer with Rhodes, Scotland. I can confirm that when I used to work for Mandy, Rhodes, she was a living wage employer.
There's quite a lot of
But now representing the group of people which Paul Spicker referred to as the main principal recipients of what's broadly classed social security. I was actually going to ask about winter fuel, so that's kind of been covered. But can I make a cautionary note? If you look at any benefit we apply a means test, there's an effect on people's behaviour. And the classic example of this is pension credit. There are 100,000 pensioners in Scotland who are entitled to pension credit who don't claim it. And it's not just because they're embarrassed or whatever, it's because they have a different way of looking at it in terms of an entitlement or not an entitlement, where they have to justify their income to a stranger. And the effect is not just they lose out perhaps even not even a great amount of money, but they lose out on things like council tax reduction, they lose out on housing support, they lose out on the benefits to have free dental treatment. And the way to look at this, which I would encourage,
So what would your question be?
I've heard it from Paul, is to look at this as an investment in social cohesion. And if you start to think of the system in those terms, then you're not looking at penny pinching, you're not looking at drawing back all the time. You're trying to say free personal care, which Henry introduced, it saves hundreds of millions of pounds from the acute health setting because people are living better health for longer. Is that a principle which members of the panel agree with?
Gosh, including Henry, there's a disproportionate number of people in this room that work for me, isn't there?
Well, yes, absolutely. You pay a living wage.
Here's the second one.
I am another one. I'm Carla. I'm now from the Poverty Alliance and I'm the Policy and Parliamentary Officer there. We think that now is actually a really exciting time in Scottish politics. We have these new powers coming to the Scottish Parliament over taxation and welfare, and it's providing a real opportunity for us to think about the type of Scotland we want to live in. I think most of the panel are in agreement, if not all, that what we want to do is we really want to lift children out of child poverty. I think to do that we're going to have to be radical and it's going to be expensive. What we are calling for, alongside a significant number of other third sector organisations in Scotland, is for child benefit to be topped up. We'd like to see an extra £5 per child given the child benefit. It's a big ask, but it would really, really reduce numbers of children living in poverty in Scotland. So I want to know, will any of the parties support that?
Great, thanks. Robin, you didn't work for me, but you feature in the magazine quite a lot.
I want to turn the panel's thoughts to another type of poverty, fuel poverty, a huge social justice issue in Scotland. Affects 35% of households. It's an environmental justice issue. It's an issue that exacerbates health inequalities. My particular question is around all parties on the panel have made a commitment to making energy efficiency a national infrastructure priority. So my specific question is, how ambitious about improving the energy efficiency of the existing homes in Scotland does your party think that infrastructure priority needs to be, that we tackle fuel poverty and reduce our climate change emissions in Scotland?
Right, Neil, we'll start with you. Can we keep these brief and try and not just be attacking your opponents?
I think Sarah Boyack has said that we would be bringing in a Warm Homes Act that would be addressing that issue with huge numbers of people in fuel poverty, and I know it's a particular issue in my area where we have in some of the more rural bits we don't have, for example, a gas supply to some of the villages where you've got non-traditional built houses in the new town of Livingston and the like. Fuel poverty a huge issue, so that Warm Homes Act would be looking to address a lot of these issues. In relation to child benefit, I really like that idea. I certainly, I wouldn't commit to it at the moment. I think we've got other announcements to make in due course, and I don't want to preempt them, but it's certainly the kind of thing that I think if we are serious about addressing particularly child poverty, then these are the kind of things that we have to be bold enough to make the decisions on, because it's about putting money directly into people's pockets, and that's the thing that will change things considerably for the people that we're concerned about. So this is where we have to be big and bold. We can pretend that we want to address these issues and tinker around the edges, or we can make big decisions like you're suggesting, and I would prefer to go down that route, but that takes politicians to really step up to the plate.
And on Derek's point about means testing, behavioural change.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I was not suggesting for a minute means testing. I believe in the universal system, but what I'm saying is that, and I actually agree that if you have a means tested system, you have to create that bureaucracy, and within that you stop people claiming. I mean, when I was a frontline housing officer dealing with people's claims every day, the working your way through the benefit system for anyone is very, very complex and very difficult, and I would challenge, certainly know the people in this room who probably deal with it day in, day out, but any man or woman in the street, and certainly most politicians, they fill in a benefit form successfully the first time round without any assistance. It's a challenge.
God, Neil, you've had more jobs than Mr. Ben.
I have had many jobs.
Alex?
The poor take-up of pension credit, for example, is one of the reasons why the UK government is currently moving towards a more standardised approach to pensions, which is, perhaps the opposite of some of the things we've been discussing, but it's a policy decision, and that's where we're going in order to make sure the money's available. So I hope that contributes something, but ultimately that is a decision already made. The other subject, the issue of fuel poverty and energy efficiency. Now, the two things are directly related, but in policy terms they're actually completely different things as well. There are reasons why we want people to use less energy that are different from the reasons we want them to spend less on energy, so to speak. So we need to be doing it for more than one reason, and that's why it's a double return if we invest in improving the housing stock in Scotland and trying to get energy efficiency in our houses up. We need to be adventurous about that, because there's been money made available by a number of routes, including money levies taken off the energy companies and things like that, and there's been times when we just can't give it away. People are phoning up saying, we've got free money if you want to improve the insulation in your house, and people are laying the phone down, not believing the offer they've had. So that's why it's difficult to achieve that, and I think a bit more coordination through government to make these funds available wherever possible, to focus it into social and affordable housing, but also to make it available to private homeowners where they're willing to make that change, because at the end of the day it's not only about making it cheaper to heat a house, it's about using less energy across the board regardless of what it costs. So I think we need to pursue that one. The final thing is, there's a lot said in Scottish politics that are about all the things we could do if we had the power to do it, all the money we could spend if we just had the power. But the truth is that next year, and more importantly the year after, when all the tax powers are in the hands of the Scottish Government, we will only have the money to spend that we can raise through effective taxation. Our ambition is boundless, but what we can raise in tax relates to how we levy tax in Scotland. And that's why we need to have a much more basic conversation about what can be raised from Scotland, what effects that changes in the tax system may have, and whether there is the danger that some might tell you about, that we could whack up the amount of income tax that we charge rich people, and the rich people may choose not to pay that tax by paying other taxes or simply by leaving.
And Alex, quickly, would you put £5 on the child benefit?
No, I'd probably I'd work out what the £5 on the child benefit was, and I'd work out the most effective way to use it somewhere else.
Okay, Paul.
Okay. I'll be brief, but only because we've been asked to be brief.
Only because there are more questions.
More questions. Get more questions. Yeah, you're absolutely right, and you see every year when the deadlines reach for benefits, particularly for pensioners, that the councils are on their Facebook page, the councillors are on their Facebook page, sending out emails to people. I even got one advising me to claim for something that I wasn't entitled to, because I'm in my 30s. And that's absolutely right. We need to do things that actually address that and ensure that the right people are getting the help that they need. And Derek, I look forward to working with you and hearing more ideas about how we can do that to ensure, and yourself, Paul, to ensure that those benefits are going to the right people, and how we can do that without creating an additional layer of bureaucracy. On fuel poverty, we're getting more powers in the government, and particularly that will enable us to address more fuel efficiency, and I hope to do that, and I hope to see more things coming out of the investments made in the Green Investment Bank that will lead to new technology, so that we can see new technologies introduce greater savings. And Carla, I'll spend a bit more time on this child benefit radical.
It's just a yes or a no. Come on.
Well, I know. I mean,
yes or no. Yes, Paul.
The answer is yes, I would like to do that, because I want to see more radical solutions come. It's not in my party's proposals. The pupil premium is that will hopefully close the gap between the poorest and the wealthiest, and what we know is a huge, significant gap. But believe me when I say that if I'm elected as an MSP, I'll be an open door to any ideas, any plans that we have to address child poverty.
Great. All right.
Okay, can I first of all say that child poverty has to be a top priority for all of us. In terms of the specific answer to the question, I'm not in a position to say yea or nay today, like Neil and others, but obviously specific proposals on how we deal with poverty, including child poverty, will be rolled out in due course. The second point about fuel poverty, very clearly fuel poverty, again, as is all aspects of poverty, is a top priority. We are focusing resources on people in fuel poverty at the lower end of the income scale in terms of the investment programme that we have, because very clearly fuel poverty generally is defined as anybody spending more than 10% of their disposable income on heating their home. Now obviously if you're on £100,000 a year and you spend £12,000 heating your home, you're perhaps not in such a priority case than if you're on £10,000 a year and having to spend more than £1,000 heating your home. So the investment is very much directed at the lower income groups as a top priority. In relation to the national infrastructure priority, since we were the ones who made it the priority, inevitably we are going to and planning to invest heavily in energy efficiency, which also helps with the fuel poverty agenda and also helps with the climate change agenda as well. So you get 3 hits for the price of 1 in terms of that investment. And finally, let me say that I'm absolutely in total agreement with what Derek said, and the fact Alec Johnson, surprisingly, but I'm delighted to see he said earlier that you've got to give people a stake in our society. If you go back and read the Commission on Social Justice that John Smith set up when he was leader of the Labour Party, one of the points made there in favour of universalism is that one of the benefits of universalism, which you can't apply to every single benefit, but it's a balance, but one of the points in favour of universalism is that you give people who are paying the higher rate of tax a stake in our society, and it also helps social cohesion and social solidarity. Can I just say it's a great pity that John Smith wasn't the Labour Prime Minister instead of Blair and Brown, because it would have been far, far better, and he would have been a Labour Prime Minister, unlike Blair or Brown.
There might not have been a Scottish Parliament, however.
Yeah, I'm sure there would have been if John had been the Prime Minister.
Andy?
Yes, I agree with Derek. And on the child benefit, I mean, we'd be very open to thinking about that. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure the extent to which all parties have fully considered and will be bringing forward fully considered proposals for what to do with new social security powers, because there's, what, a dozen or so of them.
11.
That's almost
a dozen. You'd normally say that was 13 or 14.
And this is obviously something that's going to be considered in great detail in the next Parliament. What I would say is that we are keen to open up a better quality conversation on the kind of investment we're prepared to make in the quality of public services and the quality of life and the quality of universal services we want to have. And we think that conversation has to start with ending the trajectory we've been on to being a low-tax, diminishing quality of public services society in the UK. We need to start considering paying more, fairly and progressively, to deliver. It's in the number. It's a very sobering experience going around canvassing, because a lot of people I speak to are having problems with relatives not getting the care package they need, grandchildren not being able to afford housing, etc. So when you open up a conversation, well, but how much tax, income are we receiving? What's the state of the economy? What's the degree of progressivity in our tax system? People begin to get the idea that they want to make more of an investment. So we've put forward tax proposals that will raise in the region of £800 million a year extra. We're not saying they're perfect or whatever, but we think we need to have that conversation. And if Poverty Alliance has thought in detail about the best routes out of poverty, particularly for children, includes £5 on child benefit, we'd be very, very open to talking about that. Finally, on the fuel poverty, Greens have been leading the field, I think, in the last Parliament on this. It's absolutely critical that we do that for all the reasons you suggest. I go back to Germany. Germans are now living in houses that are bigger, lasting longer, and costing nothing to heat for the same price as housing was in the 1970s. Not only have we financialised the British economy, but we've turned it into a vast Ponzi scheme.
Andy, I'm going to have to wind you up.
I'll stop there.
Okay, Neil's used his influence. He wants to make a very small point.
Just a very small point in fuel poverty. If you look at solar energy, look at who has benefited from the installation of solar panels on houses. It isn't the people who need the solar energy most. It's middle class people who can afford to put solar panels on their roof. So the people who are in fuel poverty are not benefiting from solar energy. It's people who've got the money to put the panels on the roof, and I think that's where the mistake is made.
So I saw some more hands, yeah. Okay, Fiona, I'm going to just have to take these two. I'm afraid we should have finished, so if we just take these to the gentleman at the back and lady at the front. Lady at the front.
Right, I'm from People First Scotland, Edinburgh. What are people who are not part of the labour market? Sorry. Aye. Will you make sure that people with learning disability get the support they need to live independently in the communities?
Thank you very much.
And also to raise children without them being taken off them and put into care.
Thank you.
I'm Brian Martin, Scottish Pensioners Forum. I welcome what's been said that takes us holistically into the question of psychological contract around taxation and benefits. Taxation treated in its entirety and benefits treated in their entirety. I have a question that takes us into the muddy waters of reserved matters and the more difficult territory of emergent and possible future inequalities. Can you say what the Scottish Government can and should do in relation to inequities associated with the new state pension arrangements and to help secure a decent state pension for future generations?
Great. Sorry, I missed your name at the beginning.
Grant.
You lady in front. Bianca, sorry. Right. Can we be brief, guys? Bianca, but it's how can we help people with disabilities living in the community and also protect their children who may be at risk of being taken into care?
Well, on the disability issue, then effective use of the resources that are available, targeted onto those who need it most, I believe will have an effect on that. Decisions about children are ones that are effectively made independently by social workers. Quite often we need to make sure that there's greater understanding there, but I think we're making changes there. On the issue of pensioners, I believe perhaps Alec can confirm to me, but the Scottish Government will not be in a position to make changes to pensions. What it can do is provide top-up benefits to those whose income falls below that is an acceptable level. So that I think while the pensioners will be treated in much the same way as other benefit claimants will be, there's nothing we can do about pensions.
I can honestly say that's one of the few correct things that Alec has said. Okay, so in actual fact, we don't really have power to change the new pension arrangements. We would have done it completely differently because clearly there's a lot of people who are expecting to be guaranteed over £155 a week from the 5th of April, and they'll get a surprise, some of them, because they won't get £155 a week under the new arrangements. The general principle about trying to simplify the pension system we agree with, but we think this is not the best way to do it. In terms of independent living, as you know, the UK government abolished the Independent Living Fund. We have kept it going in Scotland for two reasons. Number one, the people who got support from the Independent Living Fund need that support and will continue to get that support. But secondly, we believe very strongly in the principle of independent living. We don't see why everyone else should have independent living, but disabled people don't have independent living. And all our policies in relation to this are geared towards independent living. And that's why we passed the legislation on self-directed support. And an increasing number of people now who are receiving social care packages are doing so through self-directed support, because that gives them, again, a choice, and it gives them control over the resources that are being spent on them. And in terms of the powers of social workers to take away children, clearly, if there is a need to change the law at any point, then obviously that would be something, no doubt, any future government look at. But clearly it's something we need to monitor very closely, because we want to get the balance right between protecting children, but at the same time ensuring that the state doesn't act unfairly and unnecessarily taking children out of the parental home.
See, when I had two children, the child benefit was £33.40 for the two children, and then it was frozen, and then my children were older and didn't need it. It just wasn't enough money. When you've got to buy shoes, clothes, and all the stuff you need, it's not enough money. And the benefits you get to top up for your week is just not cover children. Yeah. And then you've got folk in food banks. How's that fair?
I know. Do you know, Bianca, there's so much we could have covered today.
Honestly.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. As someone who grew up in a household on benefits, it's not enough. And it always, it perplexed me for a long time whenever, growing up in that situation, when you'd hear stories saying people are sort of swimming in money on benefits. I mean, that just wasn't...
I spend my money on my children, but lots of families who spend it on drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
That's not right either.
And I appreciate that, which is why you probably won't be surprised to hear that we say that there needs to be a more individualistic approach taken, and that we'd encourage all services and look to social work, to all departments, providing support to ensure that it's an individualistic approach, not a broad sweep brush, which we seem to see increasingly taken in a more centralised model. We want to see more individualistic decisions made, and for people working directly to be able to make the best decisions to support you. Is that okay?
Yes. Pensions.
And on pensions, I mean, it is a devolved matter, but it does feel in some ways like the proposals announced that are coming in is undoing a lot of what was good work previously done in the last 5 years and beyond. But it is a devolved issue, so it's not something that we have proposals directly coming to address. But as a federalist, I want to see more powers come into Scotland.
Andy?
Yeah, very briefly. Bianca, I would agree with what Alex Neil said about independent living, and I think, just to make sort of broad points about both questions, I think because 3 billion or so of social security funds are going to be devolved in the next Parliament, and because I think across most of the parties there's broad agreement about the scope for improvement, that I would like to see this as one area. There are many other areas where we can actually have very, very effective cross-party working in the Parliament and very, very effective engagement with users, and actually get this right, because the failings we've seen coming out of the current Tory government, in my view, are unforgivable in terms of how they're affecting people's lives. We're a small country, we could get this right. And just the final point on pensions, which is a related matter as well. A number of issues I've engaged in Parliament about, and the answers come back, this is a reserved matter. I actually think there's now 54 SNP MPs in Westminster. There's always been 57 60 or so Scottish MPs, I think that the answer to some questions that relate to reserved matters, either partially or exclusively, should cease or be less about this is nothing to do with us, it's reserved, and more about, well, let's pick up the phone. Let's talk about it. Now, I don't think we're going to have much traction on things like pensions, right? But on things like the tax avoidance we've seen today in Panama and stuff, there's a willingness in the UK government to do something about that. There was an issue came up with Scottish limited partnerships who brought down the Moldovan banking. Again, the answer was it's reserved. Well, let's pick up the phone and talk to the UK government. So I think both there needs to be more cross-party working in the Parliament to get it right, and more productive. And I know there are productive relationships with Scottish government and UK government on a number of issues, not least the fiscal framework and all the rest of it. But I think we need to do much, much more about that. And some of the big wins, I'll finish here, have actually occurred when parties have worked together to write, I think it was on the issue of agricultural subsidies, I remember, the parties came together in Parliament to make a demand of Westminster. On that occasion, I think it was unsuccessful, but it actually had much, much more political traction.
And finally, Neil.
In terms of your own situation, the social care system that we've got at the moment, I think social care is the biggest issue in Scotland at the moment. I genuinely said this for a long time, that the social care system that we have at the moment will never deal with the ageing population that we've got and with people in the community who need the support and are not getting it at the moment. And I think it's a travesty what's happening in social care. The way in which the whole system has been driven down in a race to the bottom in terms of the wages and conditions of the people who work in it, but also the way in which that we need to provide support to families who are in similar situations to yourself. That's not there. So, for example, the free personal care we spoke about is a good policy, but you only get it at a certain age. So, for example, my brother who gets no assistance whatsoever, why should it be age-related and not be provided for people on the basis of their need? We would get rid of the care tax as well, which is another issue for people. Finally, on the pensions thing, I am no pensions expert by any means, but it's going to be a bigger issue as we can become a more ageing population. And I think the one thing I am thankful for is that in relation to whether the constitutional argument is, you would see there was no clamour to have pensions devolved to Scotland, because if they were, you would certainly not have a pension at the rate that we have it at the moment.
Well, on that consensual note, just want to thank everybody. It's such a huge issue, and I'm aware that there's so many other things we didn't discuss. I mean, we didn't even go through the less controversial things of the named person legislation or the devolution of abortion legislation, which I'm sure we could have really enjoyed this afternoon. But I just want to thank you all very much, and thank you.
Thank you.